This is the fourth in a series of reviews of the new pop-up cycleways around Sydney. This video covers how we travel down the Bourke Street cycleway and then talk Portman Street across to the pop-up in Dunning Avenue. One thing you'll see in this video is a series of contrasts between different types of cycleway and shared path treatments. The first thing we noticed was the rather abrupt change in the nature of the Bourke Street cycleway once you get south of Danks Street. It goes from a grade separated cycleway to a shared path, and the shared path isn't marked that well as a shared path. When we crossed Danks Street, we initially weren't sure if we were supposed to be riding on what looks suspiciously like a footpath rather than a shared path. The shared path is relatively narrow in places, and you need to be careful and watch out for pedestrians stepping out of houses or businesses. That aside, the turn-off into Portman Street is easy to find. Just look for this apartment building with the multicoloured panels on the outside. From here, you roll down Portman Street and turn right into Hansard Street, and then immediately left into Dunning Avenue. And that's where the fun begins.
There we go. Whoa, what is this? Look at this. Woo. Yeah.
As you could hear from our reactions when we turned into Dunning Avenue, we were pretty surprised by what we found. Compared to all the other cycleways that we had ridden until that point, like Pitt Street and Bourke Street, etc., it was really narrow, and the entry to it when we rounded the corner wasn't obvious at all. Now, the street was obviously quite challenging for the designers, as they couldn't make major changes to the infrastructure. After all, the whole idea of a pop-up cycleway is that it is quick to build and relatively cheap and easy to install, and it can also be removed without having to spend a ton of money to return the street to its original configuration. I know this street has copped a lot of flack from cyclists who have used it, but you need to keep those restrictive design parameters in mind. The three of us all disliked the intersection treatments, the narrowness of the cycleway, the roughness of it, and the potential for being doored by passengers exiting cars parked along the cycleway. One problematic feature that the designers had to work around is these large blister islands at some of the intersections. They've been put in at some point in the past to calm traffic, but the squeeze points that they create are patently unfriendly for cyclists. Instead of routing cyclists through them, they've decided to route cyclists around them. You can argue about whether that is the least worst option or not. I presume if this cycleway becomes permanent, the jackhammers will come out and lanes will be cut through these islands for cyclists. But remember what I said a minute ago about these pop-ups being cheap and easy to install. Bulldozing concrete installations is exactly the sort of thing you're trying to avoid with a pop-up. We encountered two open car doors, and it seems a lot of cyclists have complained about that. You can avoid an open car door if the driver has parked well out from the curb, and that was the case with our first encounter. Note that the driver's side wheels are almost touching the outer white line of the parking lane. The edge of the door intruded into the cycleway, but not by much, and even a wide load like me was able to get past with no problems. However, note that a lot of vehicles along here were parked hard up against the curb, and some even had their passenger side wheels up on the curb. In those cases, an open door would block the entire lane, and that's what happened to us next. Fortunately, the door was open well in advance of us getting there, so we were able to pull up without any problems. But if it had been flung open just as we approached, we'd have had nowhere to go, and a crash would have resulted. To give you an idea about how unobservant drivers can be when it comes to cyclists, we stopped here for 10 seconds before this lady noticed us, and she got a bit of a surprise when turned around and saw us there, and was quite apologetic and moved on. But that just shows you they're really not looking out for us at all. The last major problem is the way you have to merge back onto the road at the roundabouts. Depending on the car parking situation, you may find that there are cars parked right up to the merge point blocking a view of the traffic and a driver's view of the cycleway. I was certainly taken by surprise the first time we reached one of these merge points, and I can see how it would be really easy for a young or inexperienced cyclist to keep on going and get hit by a vehicle coming up from behind that they didn't see. Because of the acute angle of the merge, you really have to twist around to see if any vehicles are coming up behind you, and that's not easy if you've got a bung neck like me. On the day of our tour, the sightlines and the approach to two of the merge points were relatively clear. One merge point is next to a driveway, so that means it should always be clear. Another is also close to a driveway, but parking is allowed between the driveway and the roundabout. When we rode through on a weekend, there was no one parked between the driveway and the roundabout, but I can imagine this parking spot being used during the week and sight lines therefore being blocked by parked vehicles. However, the other merge points had a continuous line of parked vehicles leading up to them, and popping out from behind parked vehicles really gave me the willies. My take on Dunning Avenue is that the temporary nature of the pop-up cycleway, plus the need to build something relatively quickly, has created a concept that is a bridge too far. Look up the movie if you don't get the analogy. The cycleway is one long series of concessions to the existing built environment, and those concessions or trade-offs mean that it doesn't really work. It's not really satisfactory. All the other pop-up cycleways that we looked at work because they have sufficient road space to work with, and this one doesn't. It could work, but that would involve things like making Dunning Avenue one way, or removing parking on one side of the road, putting up barriers along the cycleway that prevent people exiting vehicles on the passenger side, or removing some parking spaces at the merge points just before roundabouts. This cycleway has certainly copped a lot of flack from cyclists who have used it, but that doesn't mean that a cycleway along here isn't required. It just means that a safer cycleway design is required, and that is going to be much more disruptive than the current setup. So, we'd certainly give it an A for effort, but, I don't know, a C- for implementation.